Hi, everyone. My name is Marty. I'm the Conservation Director at Blue Mountain Land Trust. And I'm going to open our discussion today with a little background information on conservation easements, which is the tool that land trusts often use to protect fish and wildlife habitat. This picture is one of a restoration project on the Touchy River that we completed a conservation easement on in partnership with the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation this past December. So an example of a project I'm going to talk about. Next slide, please. So what is a conservation easement? A conservation easement is a voluntary agreement between a private landowner and a qualified entity that creates permanent limits on the uses of the land. Those are deed restrictions. They're recorded with the county and they run with the land regardless of future ownership or transfer. So that landowner maintains ownership of the property and can sell the property, leave it to their heirs, etc. But those restrictions in that easement stays in place regardless of that transfer. A qualified entity is either a government agency, a land trust, or other nonprofit organization, and soil and water conservation districts are also qualified entities. There are some differences between states and what the state statute identifies as a qualified entity, but those are the few that tend to be ubiquitous across states. Next slide, please. So what is required for a conservation easement? To be a qualifying conservation easement, you must meet the IRS Internal Revenue Code section 170. That's your little legal citation for the day. But a conservation easement has to remove the right to subdivide the land, extinguish or severely restrict development rights in the future, and it has to be in perpetuity or run forever. It also has to meet a qualified conservation purpose, and those purposes can be for public use, for hiking or nature preserves, for maintaining or preserving natural habitats, scenic enjoyment of the general public, or pursuant to a federal, state, or local government conservation objective. So oftentimes that's where we see agricultural land preservation. Next slide, please. So how can a conservation easement be used to specifically protect a riparian area? Well, an easement itself will remove subdivision or development rights from the land adjacent to a riparian area. So that restricts future impacts on that area. Easements can also include other provisions, such as ones that preserve native vegetation, limits the removal of native vegetation. Easements often prohibit mining, logging, road development, other extractive uses. It also can exclude or place limitations on agricultural use. So we see this most often on ag lands that have riparian protection easements, is that they prohibit grazing or severely restrict grazing in riparian areas. And easements can protect these restored areas from conflicting or detrimental uses. So that might mean prohibiting the removal of large wood structures that have been installed, other specific restrictions that are related to the particular restoration work or habitat that's being preserved in that riparian area. Easements can also allow for restoration and allow partners to undertake restoration and the landowner to undertake restoration on the property. And they can also create riparian management zones. And so if you have a larger easement that encompasses an entire property, but you want to specifically manage the riparian area in a different way, an easement can create management zones that will have additional restrictions or permitted uses in that area. Next slide, please. So an easement requires a lot of steps, and I'm going to go briefly through the due diligence that is required to complete a conservation easement. Next slide, please. So first of all, we want to talk about how we pay for easements. Easements are either purchased using either nonprofit funds, so internal fundraising, or state and federal agencies pay the value of a conservation easement. Some agency funders listed here in our region include NRCS, OWEB, the Oregon Agricultural Heritage Program, Washington Recreation and Conservation Office, and Bonneville Power Administration, although there are other funds and funders available. And an easement is paid in a cash payment to the landowner at closing. Next slide, please. Easements can also be donated. The landowner can donate the value of the easement where they don't receive any funds, but they can take a tax deduction under that internal revenue code provision that we identified earlier. There are additional income tax benefits for farmers and ranchers. So if you are a farmer or rancher, meaning you earn 50% or more of your income from farming or ranching, you can take this tax deduction and extend it for up to 15 years. Next slide, please. So the big question then becomes, how do you value a conservation easement? How is this determined? We have to get a very specialized appraisal, which determines the value of the conservation easement. And how this is valued is we look at the before value of the property and the after value. So if you were to place the property for sale on the market today with all of its rights and development rights and subdivision rights intact, that is your before value. What would it go for? The after valuation would be the appraiser's assessment of what would the property be worth with its rights removed or restricted. And the difference between those two values is the value of the conservation easement. And if you are having a landowner that donates the property, it's required that you have an appraisal by the IRS to support their tax deduction. And if you are having the easement funded through a state or federal agency, the appraisal will be required to justify the purchase price and the grant funds. Next slide, please. So here's just a little quick example to drive that home. Harry and Rachel's farm worth $4 million today on the fair market unencumbered. They then place a conservation easement on the property that removes the right to subdivide and develop the property, which reduces its appraised value to $3 million. So the easement would be worth $1 million, the difference between the current value of the land and the value of the land with an easement on it. Next slide, thank you. So we do have some standards for appraisals that we have to meet. So not every appraiser is qualified to appraise a conservation easement. It's it's just a more specialized type of appraisal, but the standards are USPAP or Yellow Book, and those are what your funders and the IRS will require. Next slide, please. So one of the first things a land trust has to do before placing a property under easement is review the property's title, make sure that it's free of mortgages, liens, or other encumbrances. If there are encumbrances, we have to identify any existing or potential impacts to the property's conservation values. So if there is a utility line easement right of way, does that go right through your protected habitat? If there is an access easement for a neighbor to drive through the field, is that going to impact your restoration or conservation values? There might be mineral reservations or timber reservations. And so we look at all of those title encumbrances, remove any if possible that may impact the conservation values. And then we also want to map those pretty extensively so we know where they are in the ground and know that in the future, if there are going to be, if there's going to be a utility company that's going to come out there and, replace their line, where in the property is going to be impacted. But some of these encumbrances aren't readily available on the title. Mineral reservations in particular are in a separate federal land database. So you have to do quite a bit of background checking to make sure that you are getting the full picture of the property. Next slide, please. We also have to do an environmental site assessment. So a phase 1 that identifies potential or existing environmental contamination liabilities. That looks at both the underlying land, the physical improvements like any buildings and any surrounding properties that may have any issues. If your phase 1 finds something, then you might have to get a phase 2 that evaluates the presence and extent of the contamination or potential contamination on the property. These are really important because if an easement is going to protect a property for forever, we want to make sure we're not protecting a hazmat site and in fact are taking care of something that is environmentally sound. So we also need to survey any areas of use, any potential property boundary issues, Then a survey is really important for legally describing and mapping the conservation easement area, especially if the easement is only going to cover a portion of an entire property. Want to make sure that in the future there are no questions or concerns about where the easement boundaries actually are. So getting a survey is really important. If there is a building envelope or an area in which their landowner has reserved the right to build something in the future or maintain a current building, we would like to have that surveyed to ensure that any future development happens within its permitted area. It also is important to resolve boundary disputes. Oftentimes you see this where the boundary of a property is the middle of the river or the border of the river. And then it also can help resolve title discrepancies or relocate encumbrances that may impact the conservation values. So for instance, if your neighbor has a right of way and you want to have them move it, we want to survey out the new place. Surveys are incorporated into the conservation easement as an exhibit, and they are also recorded with the county so that they stay permanent and easy to track. Next slide, please. Other potential due diligence, water rights analysis is probably the most important here. If there are water rights associated with the property, particularly if you're doing a riparian protection project, you want to have the copies of the certificates, determine the water rights location, map any points of diversion, et cetera. And then again, if there are mineral rights, you may have to do an assessment to see if there is any danger of those minerals being extracted in the future. Lastly, but probably most importantly, we have a baseline documentation report. So a baseline documents the important conservation values and the property's condition at the time it's going into the easement. And that's really crucial because in the future, as we monitor and enforce the easement, we want to know what did the property look like at the time it was protected and what were the conservation values on that property. Next slide, please. So baseline documentation is pretty extensive. It also may have additional requirements based on the specific type of project, but oftentimes you'll want, to make sure that it's signed. That includes that property description and location. As many maps of the property are useful, so maps of the general property as well as where our specific habitat values, specific encumbrances or other identified exceptions. We want to know the history of the property and its current use and any other background information that might be helpful. Did you take all your photos during an incredibly irregular high flow part of the season? You want to document that so when somebody goes out in a future year, they're not shocked that the creek is substantially lower. Those types of things are really important. Next slide, please. So again, just documenting all of the conservation values. We extensively feature photographs and establish monitoring photo points on the property as well, so that there is also a visual representation of these conservation values for looking back in time. And then we also want to document any existing conditions that we may have concerns about. So are there areas of visible erosion? Are there man-made improvements? Those types of things. And also including copies of all of your due diligence materials. So your surveys, your water rights certificates, et cetera. Next slide, please. So here's an example of a baseline map that we have in one of our projects. You can see we have fences, structures, roads, management zones, et cetera, all mapped out on a property so that it's kind of that big snapshot in time of where were things when we protected this property. Next slide, please. We also take photos that have GPS information on them. So not only is it a photo of the property, the creek, we can redo this photo every year into the future because we have the specific information. We also track GPS tracks of where we've been on a property every year so that when we go out to monitor in future years, we can see if there's places we haven't been to recently or if there are places where we might need to go over and over again. So those are some other tools we use to monitor our properties. We have to do that annually and in perpetuity, right? The easements are, conservation easements are permanent. Next slide, please. So a bit about our land trust. We work in southeastern Washington and eastern Oregon, 11 counties total. We have staff that live in John Day, LeGrand, and Walla Walla. And we have both conservation or recreation and education programs. And we're nationally accredited by the Land Trust Alliance. The Land Trust Alliance is kind of our national governing body that sets standards and practices for land trusts, including some of those that were referenced in the easement materials, to ensure that we're all operating with the best practices in all of our projects. So our land trust in particular has specialized almost exclusively in conservation easements. We have 18 conservation easements and have recently purchased our first property. And collectively, they protect over 22,575 acres of land and over 32 miles of streams and rivers. So you'll hear a little bit later from other land trusts that have more fee acquisitions. We have found in our service area, just given our the makeup of our land, that conservation easements have been our biggest tool so far. Next slide, please. So some of the riparian conservation work that we have done is that we have many of our easements have riparian area protections. So specific management zones that identify additional restrictions in riparian areas specifically. And so that has how we have addressed riparian area protection on some of our larger working farms and ranches. And we also have some riparian area only conservation easements. And we have partnered in with entities like the Confederated Tribes, the Umatilla Indian Reservation, to protect restoration areas specifically. So the easement is 100% focused on maintaining the riparian restoration project, riparian health focused, and does not encumber the rest of the property. And lastly, we are actually just putting our toe in the restoration pool and learning about riparian restoration as a landowner for the first time. So I'm really excited to learn more about what other land trusts in this group are doing. We purchased Phipps Meadow. It's a property in Eastern Oregon. It's the headwaters of the Middle Fork of the John Day River. You can see some aerial footage here. And we're going to be undertaking our first riparian restoration project. So it'll be nice and interesting for us to be on the other side of the project work.